So, as you guys can see, this is part 3 of Freedom Through the Wilderness. I want to continue our reflections. I've done a couple talks in this regard, just trying to focus on how we can experience God, our experience with God, even in the midst of difficult and uncertain times. It's not really a surprise to any of us here that the last couple years have been kind of tricky. And life can sometimes seem that way. And in the midst of life experiences, we can have experiences, times or seasons where it feels like we are kind of going through a desolate wilderness experience, which is a life theme. It is a biblical theme. As part of these reflections, we've been remembering the big story of the Bible, which really is part of our big story. It's the big story of the Exodus. Such a big story that Hollywood has made a movie of it more than once. You know, there's the cartoon Prince of Egypt. Is that what it was called? Prince of Egypt engages the Exodus story. There's the good old Charlton Heston as Moses. And the Exodus story. There's been numerous recountings of the Exodus story because it's like one of those foundational stories that just resonates with our humanity. It's like it's ingrained in our DNA, this, oppression and slavery and freedom and God's rescue of us. And we need to remember that story from time to time. It's often a part of our experience. And personally, I feel like I sort of bumbled into these reflections. I wasn't really planning on it. I felt like God kind of led me in that direction, and I do think it was a God thing. And I think that these reflections actually coincide pretty well with the season that we are in on a number of different levels, partly just with the current state of the world. The last couple years of isolation and masking and all the stuff in the media has been a bit of a desert experience. It's been a bit of a wilderness experience. There's been a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unknown. It's also, I think, relevant because we're in the season of Lent. We're about halfway through the Christian season of Lent, this traditional season where we try to be intentional to prepare for the celebration of Easter. And Easter is this season where we really have a focus on rebirth and renewal. It's a focus on God releasing new life, but part of the practice of Lent is often fasting or giving up some comfort in life. And we do this in part as an intentional way of remembering Jesus' own 40 days of trial and temptation in the wilderness. Even Jesus went through a wilderness experience. And I think it's important for us to take time to remember that Jesus himself had to pass through a crucible of hardship. Jesus himself had to go through this experience where he learned and he practiced trust and dependence on God. That's a lesson that we need to learn, but Jesus himself had to learn that and experience that, and he modeled it for us. And so I think this might be especially important for us at this time, just considering the last couple years and the challenges that they've brought. We're in the midst of trying to move forward towards a new normal, hoping that COVID is behind us, but we're still faced with a lot of uncertainty in the world. It has been a really hard couple years for a lot of people. And some of it's really sad. I read yesterday, it was in the paper, the newspaper, but Alberta in 2021 set a new record for deaths by drug overdose. Nearly 2,000 people died last year, 2021, from drug overdose. Mental and emotional health for many people has really taken a big hit over the last couple years. It has just genuinely been hard. And I think, close to home for us, many of us are feeling the weight of the health challenge that Christine and Real and their family are facing. It's a burden that we're feeling. I forgot to mention to you guys, just so you know, a little bit more of an update. Christine posted recently on the page, but she does have an appointment on Wednesday at the Cross Cancer Institute where they're gonna explore treatment options. But again, very real challenge and very real burden that we're feeling with a member of our church family. Feeling a burden for them, praying for Christine's healing and reaching for hope for them, wanting to encourage and support them. I mentioned a couple weeks ago the very tragic and senseless death of one of the kids from here at the youth center. She had been part of our Wednesday night youth events, and a few weeks ago was killed in a hit and run. Her loss, she actually was at church. She popped in 2 weeks before she was killed, and I chatted with her that morning, and 2 weeks later she's gone. That one has been a hard one for me to process. And then, take a look at the world. We have the war in Ukraine. Like, seriously, could the world get more ridiculous? Let's celebrate COVID ending by having a war. Go ahead, Russia, invade Ukraine. Like, what the heck? Another heavy. And what does that mean for the future? They're already predicting that war is going to cause a food crisis with global implications. So, I think this is especially a time for us to remember that when the earth quakes and its people live in turmoil, this is God speaking, I am the one who keeps its foundations firm. For us, our experience, like the psalmist, we can be honest and real. God, sometimes it actually does feel like you forget us. We know you don't, but sometimes it feels that way. Well, Lord, sometimes things feel really shaky. Sometimes it feels like we don't have anything stable to stand on. But God reminds us that He is the one who does keep the foundations firm despite how it might feel. So in many ways, many ways, I think, as we observe Lent, as we look forward to the renewal of the Easter promise, we're walking through a season with a lot of suffering and with some uncertainty. And how do we process these things? Because we need to process them. As part of my own journey in this season, coming through this season, last weekend, I actually, you may have noticed I wasn't here. I participated in a resiliency camp in Nordegg. I don't know if you all know where Nordegg is. It's sort of in the foothills in the mountains. It's almost an hour west of Rocky Mountain House. I got a lot of family history down that area. That's kind of where my mom grew up with Maxine. But I was at a Christian adventure camp called Frontier. And Frontier is a special place for me because I do have a lot of family history there. It's actually, my parents actually met at that camp. So it's always kind of cool for me when I go out there because I grew up hearing stories of the place. So when I came across that opportunity that Frontier was running this resiliency camp, I jumped at it because I realized in my own heart, my own spirit, my own mind, emotionally, mentally, I needed to process some things. I needed some nature therapy. I needed to get outside. I needed to get in the mountains. For me, that's the place where I feel like I connect with God the most. And I needed that time with God to reflect on the season and to process some of my own feelings. Time to reflect on my own mental and emotional health. Because I have personally found the last couple of years challenging in a number of ways. And then when I got back, and it was a good weekend away. It was a great weekend away. I can tell you more if you wanna hear. You can take me out for coffee. But transitioning back to regular life here at home after my time away was a little bit difficult, actually, to try and get back into the rhythm of things. And then on, I think it was Wednesday morning, I met with my spiritual director. For about a year and a half now, I've been meeting once a month with a spiritual director, and we chat about life and spiritual health and process things and whatnot. And I had a great visit with him, and as part of our time together, again, just partly reflecting on current events, he made a reference. This is partly why I click so well with this guy. He really knows how to speak my language. He made a Lord of the Rings reference. So he, talking about, current events, he made reference to the rumblings of Mordor. Some of the crazy stuff going on being like the rumblings of Mordor. And he really spoke to my heart. And that idea did remind me of the great speech of Sam Gamgee, and you guys might know the one. I am going to show it this morning. I appreciate your guys' indulgence of all my Lord of the Rings references over the years, and here's another one. But you might remember the scene, and they are really feeling the burden of the weight of everything going on. And Frodo is saying to Sam, I can't do this anymore, Sam. Like, I'm done. I'm spent. I can't do this anymore. And this is Sam's response. He says, I know. He's feeling it too. I know. It's all wrong. You know, by rights, we shouldn't even be here. But we are. And it's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were, and sometimes you didn't want to know the end, because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way that it was when so much bad happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you, that meant something, even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't, because they were holding on to something. And Frodo say, what are they holding on to, Sam? What are we holding on to? That there is some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for. And for all of us, there is still lots of good in this world, church fam. There's lots of good in this room. There's lots of good in each of our lives. There's lots of good in the lives of our friends and family, and that good is worth fighting for. And as part of these reflections, I've shared this quote because I think it highlights really well how we connect with the Exodus story, why it speaks to us. This guy, Alistair McGrath, he says that the Exodus story tells our story. Each of us has a personal journey to make from our own Egypt to our promised land. We have left something behind in order to make this journey. We have had to break free from our former lives in order to begin afresh. We were in Egypt, but we were delivered from bondage. We are in the wilderness on our way to the promised land because we're not there yet. All the difficulty has not been taken from our lives. We still encounter hard things. We still face difficult things. We still face hardship and suffering. We're in this wilderness, but we are on our way to the promised land. The story of the Exodus involves us because it is about us. In so many ways, the Exodus story is our story. It's part of the human condition. We get stuck or we experience something really difficult and we look to God for help, and He brings us help or encouragement in some way. He might rescue us, and in our humanity, what we really hope will happen is that He will rescue us, and that rescue will be like this automatic transportation to the promised land. We want to go from the difficulty to everything being healed and whole and perfect and good. No more hardship, no more struggle. But that's not the case. We often find ourselves wandering. We get a rescue to a degree, but then we wander in a wilderness experience where things are being healed and improving, but there's still challenge. The wilderness, the in-between, the unpredictable. And part of the invitation in that place is the invitation to learn to trust and depend on God in the midst of the unknown, searching for the path towards the promised land. In many different ways, sometimes over and over again, we travel through a wilderness because we need to learn the lessons of the wilderness. The wilderness is often our crucible of transformation. Now, I know that this isn't really a fun line of thinking, but I would like to challenge you this morning to consider ways in your own life that you might wrestle still with being a slave to something that in certain ways has you tied down or in some form of bondage. Sometimes this can be because of outside circumstances. It's outside circumstances that are pushed on us. It's not our choice. We can feel trapped in situations that seem to exist beyond our control. But sometimes we're also slaves to ourselves. We get trapped in patterns of thinking and feeling that can rob us of greater freedom. We can be slaves to image and appearance. We can be slaves to substances, and we can be slaves to relationships, to compulsive behaviors, or to abusive systems. As free as we'd like to be or imagine that we might be, each of us continues to wrestle with what the Bible calls the old self or the old nature. Unfortunately, without even realizing that it's happening, we sometimes get stuck in old ways of thinking and acting. We get stuck in old patterns of acting, and often we don't even realize it. This Ian Cron made this observation that no prison is more secure than the one that we don't know that we're in. Many of us are bound and tied down by things that we don't even recognize. We don't even realize some of the things that are holding us back. And if you guys remember the story, that's exactly what happened to the Israelites when they ended up as slaves in Egypt, because the story didn't start out that way. It wasn't like, hey guys, how about 400 years of slavery? Right now we're being faced with a famine. At least they feed slaves. Let's go and just submit to oppression. It's not how the story went. Egypt was the happy option. It was like, hey, our buddy Joseph is like the second in command there. They got plenty of food, and he's a favored son, and we have a special place of honor. Let's go there. Let's escape hardship. At first, Egypt looked like a promised land. Life in Egypt began with great hope and possibility. But what started out as a good thing got out of balance and eventually led to a bad thing. And that's how the process often works. That's what makes this subtle deception so powerful in our lives. Sometimes the challenges of life overwhelm us in ways that we fall into certain kinds of wrong thinking, wrong seeing, and we don't even realize it. I remember, have you guys, I first came across this concept a number of years ago. I bought a music album that was titled Stockholm Syndrome, and I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what Stockholm Syndrome was, so I looked it up. But have any of you guys heard the term Stockholm Syndrome? A few of you. Okay, does anyone want to try and describe it? Les. Yeah. You start to identify with your captor or your abuser. The term comes from an actual event that happened in 1973. There was a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, hence the name. During the robbery, 4 people were taken hostage. I've never personally been taken hostage, but I think being a hostage would kind of suck. And you'd think that because of that, the hostages would have viewed the robbers as the bad guys. You think that maybe they would have looked for a chance to defeat them or to escape. At a minimum, you would think that the hostages would cheer for the police and would hope that the police would rescue them. But that's not what happened. In this instance, in this bank robbery, these hostages, they weren't cheering for the police and rescue. They were actually cheering for their captors. In some weird way, they identified with the humanity of the robbers, and they sided with them. They sided with the guys that had taken them hostage. They actually defended them. When the robbers were eventually arrested and taken to court, the hostages refused to testify against them. Now, it was confusing, not the reaction you'd expect. Why would these hostages side with the people that took them captive? Well, the experts think that what was going on was that the hostages, it was such a traumatic, emotionally overloaded experience, and it was so psychologically taxing that in an instinctive way, just trying to cope and survive, they sided with their captors. They were physically, mentally overloaded by the experience that they sided with the very people that took them captive. We can see a similar dynamic with God's people in the Exodus story. After hundreds of years, the Israelites had gotten used to their life in Egypt. They'd built homes there. They'd gotten used to the rhythm of life there, to the point that when things turned oppressive, they didn't fight it. They just kind of accepted it and cracked on with life. And when we read the story, it can seem so weird to us. What were they thinking? What were they feeling? Especially after God rescues them. You'd think this is a good thing. God just rescued you. But when they're first in the wilderness, it's the beginning of their journey to a new normal. They start to actually rebel against Moses. They want to go back to Egypt. They want to go back to captivity. And in a similar way, that we might react to the bank hostages, we kind of think the Israelites are nuts. We think, what are you guys thinking? You've just been delivered from 400 years of slavery. Are you guys nuts? You want to go back? We can't believe that they would seriously make that choice. And we assume, with our thousands of years of hindsight, that if that had been us, we would make a better choice. But would we? If we're really, really honest, recognizing our own Egypts, recognizing our own Exodus, do we? Do we make the choice to walk into the wilderness, to walk towards freedom? Or are we comfortable in our captivity? In the areas of life where we might be, in a sense, held captive, are we resisting? Or are we settling and accepting it as home? Stockholm Syndrome is all about coping, and coping is often what we do just to get through life's places, life's rough places. Faced with our own experiences of Egypt in our own lives, we often choose to stay and try to just figure out how to survive. We find our own ways to make slavery more acceptable until to us it becomes normal. We can overlook, bury, or ignore deep soul wounds in an attempt to survive. Currently, one of the books that I'm reading, Christy had read it and she recommended it to me. It's called Trying Softer, and it's by a counselor named, I've had to ask, Christy, she's not in here, good. She's getting kind of frustrated with me because I think I've asked her about a dozen times, how do you say that lady's name? It's Andi Kolber. The way Christy tried to remind me, she's like, Blondie, it rhymes with Blondie. Just remember Blondie, Andi. I was like, okay, I think I got it. Andi Kolber, Trying Softer. And in her book, she highlights two different types of trauma. What she calls big T trauma and then little t trauma. Big T trauma probably fits our more common understanding or expectation. Big T trauma is like war veteran trauma. You've been to Afghanistan, you watch your friends get blown up, you come home, and you're suffering with PTSD. That's big T trauma. Something so major that it overwhelms the physical body. It overwhelms a person's nervous system and it impacts you in a huge way. And that's not just a wartime thing. I mean, there's many examples in our own context of violence done against a person that can be very traumatic. We're human and we have limited physical capacity, and some traumatic experiences, they just overwhelm us. They're big T traumas. But what about small t traumas? Well, they're smaller. They're things that they really do leave a mark, but they're smaller. And we think, well, that's just part of life. Life is just sometimes hard. The unexpected death of a friend, or the unexpected loss of a job, or a relational breakup, a small t trauma. Life's not over, life goes on, and we generally just try to suck it up. We think we'll be okay, and we try and tell other people we'll be okay, and we try and convince ourselves that we'll be okay, and we just try to get over it, to get on with life. But here's the thing. It might be smaller, but it still leaves a mark. And our body, in our brains, we might say, oh, it's smaller, it's okay, I'll get over it. But our bodies, our physicalness doesn't say that. It leaves a mark. Our bodies feel it. And if it's not processed, it doesn't go away. And those small t traumas, they don't just disappear. They stay there, and the mark is real. And the initial weight of it might not be that heavy, but these small t traumas, one after another, they can have a cumulative effect. Eventually, physically and mentally, enough small t traumas can overwhelm us in the same way as a single big T trauma might. You might think, oh, I've never experienced a big T trauma. Maybe you haven't, maybe you have. But pretty much everyone has experienced a small t trauma. And many of us have experienced many, many small t traumas. Well, they can add up. And eventually, it can be like death by 10,000 paper cuts. It's not a one-time thing that knocks you off your feet. It's 10,000 little things that slowly bleed us to death. But we often think, oh, it's just a paper cut, I'll be okay. We don't take the little wounds and we don't take the little slavery seriously. Our own little Stockholm Syndrome. But the prophet Jeremiah, he makes this really striking observation about our broken humanity. In chapter 6, he says this, prophets and priests and everyone in between twist words and doctor truth. Here's the truth, people. My people are broken. They're shattered. And what do? They put on Band-Aids saying, oh, it's not so bad. You'll be just fine. But things are not just fine. And sometimes, whether it's, modern counseling practices or how pastors and churches sometimes respond to our pain, it's kind of like one of those Band-Aids. A response that is too narrow or too simplistic. We can have a hard time recognizing pain, accepting pain as part of life, acknowledging the depth of pain and the struggle in people's lives. In the limits of our humanity, we often have an aversion to suffering. We don't go there. It feels yucky, so let's avoid it. But we sang about it this morning. The Bible doesn't avoid it. The Bible is completely honest with it. Our faith is good and true. Our faith is beautiful. God's heart is big enough that we can be honest with our difficulties. We can be honest with our doubts and our fears. The Bible doesn't avoid it. It dives straight in. Throughout the Bible story, it unapologetically embraces the full range of the human emotional experience. Old Testament Bible scholar Walter Brueggemann, he makes this observation. He says, Israel at her best knew how to trust God in the midst of deep pain. Israel unflinchingly saw and affirmed that life as it comes along with its joys is beset by hurt, betrayal, loneliness, disease, threat, anxiety, bewilderment, anger, hatred, and anguish. The study of lament may suggest a corrective to the euphoric, celebrative notions of faith that romantically pretend that life is just sweetness and joy, even delight. It may be suggested that the one-sided renewal of today has, in effect, driven the hurtful side of experience into obscure corners of faith practice or completely out of Christian worship, to our detriment. Our faith is bigger than that. Our faith can have more substance than that. We don't need to deny the hard things. God is bigger than that. That's why Jesus was able to embrace suffering to the depths that he did. In the garden, so stressed out that he's sweating blood. He could only embrace and endure that suffering because he had no doubt that God is bigger than that. But we, in our humanity, sometimes we have trouble remembering that God is with us. So we feel overwhelmed. and we stuff our pain into internal compartments, often subconsciously. We keep it just outside our emotional awareness, but the truth is it's still able to deeply impact us. Like the Israelites in Egypt, we live with a functional denial of our present reality. You know, for Israel, they were denying forced labor and genocide and slavery. For us, it's different. In our technologically driven 24/7 culture, it's 1,000 different things that we avoid or dismiss or minimize or deny. But the thing that we need to learn about wilderness journeys with God is that they're not about journeying perfectly. They're about journeying honestly. Learning through process to trust in his heart for us. And an honest look into our hearts often reveals that our hearts are addicted to managing our pain and brokenness rather than really admitting it or embracing it and then processing it. We try to cope instead of surrendering, which is why it often takes these wilderness wanderings to fully learn to live with spiritual courage and authenticity. God is for us and with us. And because of that, we can have the courage to pay attention to our hearts and the ways that certain kinds of slavery are at work in our lives. You know, I just want to take a quick reflective moment here to consider. Just do a quick snapshot of your own life. Ask God to speak to you. Can you recognize a way that you cope to avoid or manage pain? Instead of embracing it, instead of admitting it, do you have a way that you cope? Does an expression of personal slavery come to mind for you? How do you personally cope with life's pressures and stresses? Often for many of us, I think this is one of the major diseases of our culture. We tend to distract ourselves with busyness. I think busyness is a cultural disease. And in our busyness, you know, we tell ourselves that our busyness is good because we're being productive. We're getting things done. And our busyness is necessary even. You know, but is it? Consider these words. I think they're wise words from Thomas Merton. He says that to allow oneself to be carried away by a multitude of conflicting concerns, to surrender to too many demands, to commit oneself to too many projects, to want to help everyone in everything, is to succumb to violence. It can be slavery. Maybe we need to stop, pause, slow down, look around, and get real with ourselves. Maybe we need to get honest, speaking to the reality of the sadness, the pain, the grief that we might really be experiencing. Maybe the path forward is trying to show us that we need to share these struggles with each other. Maybe this is part of how we were created. When I was away on the retreat last week, I learned this really cool fact. It was one of the days we were out for a hike, and one of the camp staff that was leading the hike, she was sharing forest trivia with us, and this was really a new idea for me. I thought it was pretty cool. The really cool thing is she shared this fact with us on the hike, and then the middle of this past week, a friend of mine from St. Stephen actually emailed me, and he emailed me the exact same story, quoted with the sources. There's a TED Talk on what I'm about to share with you. I'm going to post it on the church page maybe later today. But I took it, twice in a week I've heard this. So I think God was maybe trying to get my attention. But here we go. Did you guys know that trees have an underground communication system? Trees literally talk to and support each other. They have found that there are threads of fungus that are connected to the root systems of plants and trees throughout the forest, and they cause this interconnected communication web, and the trees and plants, they literally talk to each other, and they communicate to each other their needs. If there is a plant or a tree that isn't getting enough moisture, typically it's the younger plants that have a harder time reaching the sun or maybe sucking up the moisture. If they are lacking, they communicate that to this underground system, and the other trees that have enough of their resources redirect water, nutrients to the trees that need it. The forest takes care of each other. Trees have a purposeful system of sharing resources that help the entire ecosystem of trees and plants to flourish. We got to take note, people. Even trees are often more supportive and honest with each other than we are. We come to church feeling like a wreck, and, oh yeah, I'm good. Liar, liar, pants on fire. Pretend you're a tree. Trees got no problem saying, actually, I'm short on water. I'm lacking in this area. Can you help? Even trees are often more supportive and honest than we are. Can we be honest with our hurts and struggles? Can we simply be truly present with one another in a way that offers real compassion, understanding, and support? We all hurt sometimes, and sometimes we all need support. Can we own it? Gerald May, you guys might remember this guy, Christian psychiatrist and theologian. Years ago, I shared for a number of weeks on a lot of his ideas, but he said this. He says, I'm not being flippant when I say that all of us suffer from addiction. All of us. This was kind of his big point. If you're a human being, if you're breathing, if you're alive, you do suffer from some form of addiction. It's just a matter of figuring out what and to what degree. There are different degrees. Some are definitely more manageable. Some are definitely unmanageable, but it's something we all face. And he says, nor am I reducing the meaning of addiction. I mean in all truth that the psychological, neurological, and spiritual dynamics of full-fledged addiction are actively at work within every human being. The same processes that are responsible for addiction to alcohol and narcotics are also responsible for addiction to ideas, to work, to relationships, to power, to moods, to fantasies, and an endless variety of other things that we often use to cope. He says we are all addicts in every sense of the word. Moreover, our addictions are our own worst enemies. They enslave us with chains that are of our own making, and yet that paradoxically are virtually beyond our control. Addiction also makes idolaters of us all because it forces us to worship these objects of attachment, thereby preventing us from truly, freely loving God and one another. These addictions, these forms of slavery, these things that we instinctively turn to cope, they actually suck up and consume our physical energy for better things, for better pursuits, for better and healthier relationships. In your own life, what are some of your energy wasters? What are some of your distractions? And what are they keeping you from? How many hours do we waste scrolling on social media? Or binging Netflix. I almost didn't put that one there because I was feeling a little defensive. Okay. Or snacking. Or, too much of something. Maybe it's even just comparing your life to the life of someone else. Why couldn't my life be more like so-and-so? If we follow the trajectory of those simple daily attachments, we often find at the root of that is some need for security, or a need to feel a deeper level of safety, or for intimacy, or for connection. If we go a bit deeper, we might even find that we're using some of these things to replace God. Each can be a way of coping, a reality-denying form of self-preservation that robs us of grace. We often don't realize how spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, and physiologically dependent we are on all kinds of ordinary things. And we don't recognize the impact that these kinds of ordinary attachments in our lives, that in the midst of that, we might miss the truth of how we are wrongfully submitting to a form of slavery. This is how our own Exodus stories unfold. We try and ignore our slavery to avoid it, but the truth is, God doesn't see us as slaves. In his eyes and in his heart, we are never slaves. God sees us as the people that he loves. He sees us as his children. If only we could always see ourselves that way. God sees deeply beneath our pain, beneath our broken patterns of being. And he often, and in various ways, tries to remind us of our true identity. Not as a slave, but as a deeply loved son or daughter of God. And part of the journey of leaving our own Egypts is leaving behind our old identities with God's help and the encouragement of his presence with us. Like trees, we have the opportunity and the privilege to encourage this growth in one another where we need it. This quote was in the email that my friend sent me. It's by a lady named Bonnie, and it's in her book, The Heart of Trauma. But again, referring to this tree illustration, she says, in much the same way, we humans join our inner worlds with one another through many pathways that are largely below conscious awareness, like the fungus in the root system. When we are truly present with one another, the silent resources of attention, responsiveness, and love flow in a way that nourishes healing. Pay special attention to this. Being like a tree and supporting each other doesn't mean that we're all professional counselors and we all have the exact right thing to say and we all have the best advice and we can all set each other's lives straight. That's not how it's saying we support each other. The silent, you don't even have to talk, the silent resources of attention. Do you got 2 ears? Can you hear? Can you listen to someone's story? You don't even have to respond. Can you listen with compassion, authenticity? Can we listen in a way that encourages honesty? It can be that simple. When someone enters into our brokenness with us, we begin to consider the awesome possibility that there really is a promised land. That there is hope for healing. The Exodus story tells us that, the Israelites, they resisted Moses because they were broken in many ways. Broken spirit, the effects of cruel slavery. They resisted Moses. They'd been abused for so long. They'd been institutionalized by their brokenness so fully that they had lost their capacity for a vision of hope. They didn't have hope. That's why they didn't want the wilderness. They couldn't see how it could lead to anywhere good. Let's just go back to slavery. Sometimes we too are too broken to hear and believe. And yet God is relentless in casting a vision of hope for his people. We are called to that vision, a vision of relentless hopefulness in our own lives and in the lives of others. And we need to remember that hope is more than saying, oh, it'll be okay. Suffering and struggle are very much a part of the journey toward freedom. But a hopeful vision dares to defy the voices of despair. we remember that fear is a liar. And we reach for this hopeful vision that we can have in abundance because of Jesus, through Jesus, and in that we can dare to defy the voices of despair. I do want to take a minute. I want to wrap things up. I do want to finish off just with a minute of silence. Just to give God a chance to speak to each of us. Some of the things we may be currently struggling with, or some of the things that we have struggled with over the last couple of years, and some of the things we might be struggling with going forward. What would God say to each of us this morning about those struggles? How he sees us, how he wants to be there for us. What would he speak to us? Lord Jesus, you know us better than we know ourselves. In our limited humanity, we often deceive ourselves. In our broken humanity, we are often weak. And sometimes, Lord, courage feels just out of reach. But Lord, you see us exactly as we are. You see past all the deception. And seeing everything, knowing everything, seeing our beauty, but also fully seeing our brokenness, you fully accept us and you call us forward in hope. You cast a hopeful vision. Lord, how might you want to speak to our hearts this morning? Thank you, Lord. I am, again, I don't know if I'll get to it today, but I'll try and get to it by tomorrow. I am going to post, I'm going to give you guys homework again. I'm going to post some questions to help further reflection just on some of these ideas. I'll post those on the Facebook page tomorrow. I encourage you to check them out and maybe include some of those questions in your reflection this week. The one other thing, we are going to wrap things up now. There will be time to visit, pray together. You feel free to take off if you've got somewhere you need to get to. But I do want to finish with a challenge. I want to challenge each of us this morning to be more like a tree, a supportive tree. And, maybe in the minute of silence, maybe God spoke something to you and you're realizing that you need to be honest with someone. You need to share a need with someone or a struggle with someone or some pain that you've been wrestling with. And it might be good and appropriate as you share for that individual or whoever you share with to pray with you. Let's be open to praying for one another. Let's be open to just listening. Just being an attentive, present, compassionate listener. And let's take advantage of this space to honestly process our journeys, where we're at, the good and the ugly. I'm going to throw out just a couple suggested ideas, things that we could be praying for. It would be great to just make the most of this time together to pray for Christine and Riel, pray for them and their family. Again, the health issue that they're facing is heavy. It's a burden. And we can really support them with our care, our compassion, and our prayer. Praying for the situation in Ukraine. We could definitely be praying into that one as well. And you guys might think of some others. So I'm going to throw those out there as suggestions. And we will close with that. We will put on a little bit of music. And you guys are open to share and to pray together, to visit. Lord, I do, once again, I just thank you for your heart for us. And I thank you, Jesus. I thank you that you reveal the relentless heart of God to us. The God that chases us down. the God that never forgets us, the God that embraced suffering and hardship himself in order that we might know you, that we might be able to experience your life, that we might be able to experience your hope, that we might be able to experience your healing. Lord, thank you that you are relentless. Lord, thank you for the hopeful vision that dares to defy the many voices of despair. Lord, thank you that we can be anchored in your heart. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So, go be a tree.